All right, let's talk about communities within ecosystems. So a community is a group of population. So remember, a population is one species, but if you have multiple species that are interacting with each other or could potentially interact because they are living in close proximity, then that's a community. And there could be several communities within a single ecosystem. So community interactions and what type of interactions could potentially have are classified as to whether they are positive, negative, or neutral for either party. So competition is generally negative for both species. Predation is positive for the predator, but negative for the prey, for example. So we'll talk about some of these. So competition, members of the same species are always in competition because members of the same species are generally trying to use the same resources. But members of different species also may be competing for the same resources, like cheetahs and lions are competing for the same prey species. So this could cause problems for one of the species. And there's a principle called competitive exclusion. The competitive exclusion hypothesis was developed by the Russian ecologist Gauss. And the Gauss principle is that if you have two species that are using the same resource, one species is going to lose. One species is going to be completely outcompeted, and with enough time, one species will be eliminated from that area, either extirpated, which means it's not extinct, but it's gone from a particular area, or completely extinct if both species are found everywhere that one species exists. And so he did experiments with paramecium. Again, we see the paramecium is a very popular laboratory organism. They're cheap, they are easy to grow, and he showed that even though you could get two different species of paramecium that grow separate in separate cultures, they would become very numerous. If you put them together, one species would outcompete the other one if they're competing for the same food source. And he made them compete for the same food source because he only put one type of food in there. So the niche for an organism, this is going to be important for figuring out what kind of competition is going to take place. The niche of any organism, and every living organism has a niche. Its niche is its role in the environment. So is it a predator of large herbivores? Is it a shade plant? Whatever its mode of going about in the world, or its profession, that's its niche. How does it make a living? How does it survive? How does it get energy? That's an organism's niche. And two different species that occupy the same ecological niche are going to compete with each other. So there is another principle called resource partitioning, in which species that are in the same ecosystem will take advantage of different resources. They will partition the resources into different niches so that they don't overlap. Because remember Gauss's principle that if two species, different species, are occupying the same ecological niche, one will lose. So during the course of natural selection, species have evolved to take advantage of different niches so that in one ecosystem you don't have direct species to species competition because of resource partitioning. And this is an example with wading birds, that we have birds that live on a lake shore, and they have similar diets, but they take advantage of different niches. With flamingos filtering animals out of the bottom, silt from the bottom of the lake, and all the way up to plovers who are picking insects out of the sand above the high tide line. So they have evolved different niches so that they can all live in the same ecosystem without directly competing, because that's part of Gauss's principle, is that we won't find different species directly competing with each other for this exact same ecological niche, because one would have outcompeted the other one if that was the case. So here's an example of a recent diversification of a group of lizards. They're all in the same genus. You know, here's the species name here, the two-word species name. And the genus has been abbreviated to a letter, because if you're going to abbreviate a species name, the only thing you're allowed to abbreviate is the genus. So the genus here is Anolis, so they're all anole lizards. And they are all recently diversified. And when I say recently, I mean in the last few million years. They were a single species a few million years ago, and they have diversified into slightly different ecological niches so that they don't directly compete. So some of them prefer they all hunt insects. They all have that similarity. But some of them prefer to live high in the tree canopy. Some of them prefer to live on the ground. Some of them live on the trunks of the trees. Some of them prefer shade. Some of them prefer sun. And so by evolving these slightly different preferences, this single species evolved into multiple species by resource partitioning. So although they're closely related species, they can all live in the same ecosystem without directly competing with each other. Because if you have direct competition, one is going to be pushed out. So for a species niche, the fundamental niche is the niche that a species could occupy with no competition. So if we removed all the competition for other species that might have an overlapping niche, if we remove them, the fundamental niche is the total diversity of the niche that this species could occupy. The realized niche is what it actually occupies when there's competition from related species or from species that might compete for the same resources. And there's been some interesting experiments done with this. One is with two different barnacle species. So barnacles are non-motile. They're motile in the larval stage, but once they are adults, they don't move anymore. They glue themselves to a rock. And here's two different genuses of barnacle, Chimalis and Balanus, or Balanus. I don't know how you pronounce that. And the ecologist who was studying them wanted to find out if the fundamental niche and the realized niche were the same. Because what he noticed was that if Balanus was not present, the Chimalis species would occupy a larger area. And so he did an experiment where he artificially removed all of the Balanus individuals from a particular area and then came back later to see what had happened. And what he found was that if he removed the Balanus barnacles, that species, when he came back later, the Chimalis species would have taken over that area. So it's not that the Chimalis didn't like the lower areas that got bathed in water more frequently, but they couldn't compete with the Balanus for those areas. So what his experiment showed was that the Balanus species, which prefer to be in water more than the Chimalis species can tolerate, are a stronger competitor. And where both are present, the realized niche of the Chimalis is smaller, but the realized niche of the Balanus is always the same. That they are where they want to be. They are the stronger competitor, and the Chimalis species has to live where the Balanus species is not. So in this case, we see Gauss's principle, that when we have two species competing for the same area, the same resource, in this case, these are both filter feeding animals, and they filter feed from the water. And barnacles are adapted to being exposed to the air for some amount of time. That when you have two species directly competing, they're going to resource partition so that you don't end up with direct competition because they are competing for the exact same resource. We see this with other kinds of species too. An interesting observation was that with two different species of spiny mice that live in dry, deserty areas in the Southwest, that if where they are both present, one species becomes a daytime species. So mice are mostly nocturnal and active at night, which you probably know, especially in a desert. Being active nocturnally is a very common adaptation for many different kinds of animals. But because they directly compete for the same resource, eating seeds and nuts and small insects, one species has been forced to switch to being active during the day or being diurnal, where both of them coexist. And this is because the other species, the common spiny mouse, is going to outcompete them. So the spiny mouse is the stronger competitor in that niche. So the golden spiny mouse was forced to change its niche in order to not be eliminated. So its realized niche is a daytime active mouse where the other species is present. So that's an interesting case of resource partitioning. We can see that a little bit with coyotes as well. So coyotes are normally not nocturnal. Where you find coyotes like in Yellowstone National Park or in Montana where there aren't very many people, coyotes are active during the day and during the night. But here in the Chicago area where we have humans active during the day, coyotes have switched to being almost exclusively nocturnal. You occasionally see them during the day, but mostly you will find coyotes active at night. So that's a case where coyotes are resource partitioning with us because they're avoiding us. Predation is another type of interaction. So predation benefits the predator, but not the prey, obviously. And herbivory, animals eating plants, is another type of predation. Predators and prey have adaptations to help them avoid being eaten or find their prey if they're the predator. For example, mantises have excellent vision for insects and also excellent depth perception. They also have front legs that have backward facing spines, so when they do grab something, it can't get away. Some of the adaptations that prey have include being fast, being camouflaged, or being toxic or having spines to make themselves unpalatable. This is a larva of a moth that lives in Illinois and all over the Midwest, really. And it looks very fluffy, like you might want to pet it, but actually the spines are toxic, and they will, on a microscopic level, they have like fish hook barbs on the ends, and they will stick in your skin. They will cause swelling and itchy bumps, and they can even cause an allergic reaction. Some other kinds of defense mechanisms would be like the spines on porcupines or skunks. So porcupine spines would be considered a mechanical defense. Their spines release quite easily. Oh, and they're specialized hairs. The spines on porcupines and also hedgehogs are specialized hairs that can release very easily. And the ends of them have backward pointing barbs, so that if a predator tries to bite them, or your dog, the spines will stick, and they are very hard and very painful to remove. So if a predator bites a porcupine one time, it's not likely to do it a second time. The same with skunks. My dogs have all learned about skunks the hard way, but I tell you, a dog sprayed in the mouth one time by a skunk is going to avoid skunks. And one of my dogs got sprayed right in the face one time, and after that she got sprayed a few more times, but she always got sprayed on her rear end because she was running away when she got sprayed. So she did learn. Many animals also exhibit warning coloration, which is called aposematic coloration. This is from the Greek roots that mean, aposematic is from Greek roots apo, which means away from, and sematic, that means sign. So it's a sign to stay away. That's aposematic coloration. So animals that are venomous or have a sting often display warning coloration because they too are small enough to be prey. So for example, wasps are displaying warning coloration not for their prey because they are carnivorous insects, but it's for birds that might want to eat them. That's who the warning coloration is for. There are many species of poisonous frogs, some of which are beautifully brightly colored. Quite a few people have been injured by handling poison dart frogs that are from pet stores with their bare hands. So if you find a brightly colored frog, if you're on vacation somewhere, we don't have any like that in Illinois, but we do have poisonous salamanders here. So if you find poisonous animals or poisonous amphibians, you will know they're poisonous because they're very brightly colored. Don't pick them up with your bare hands because most of their toxins can be absorbed directly through the skin. We will talk about our native species of frogs here, and none of them look like this. Camouflage is used by both prey and predators to make them harder to see. This tree frog is camouflaged for both reasons. It is a predator, it eats insects, and it is an ambush predator. But it also is prey to larger birds, and so it is camouflaged for that reason as well. Seahorses have really interesting camouflage, or at least some species do. This little video here. These seahorses look like the anemones that they live on, and the coral that they live on, rather. You do play that again. So they resemble and even move like the species that they live on. Sometimes species mimic each other's coloration. And there's two types. One is when a harmless species imitates a harmful or unpalatable species, and that's called Batesian mimicry, after the famous 19th century naturalist Bates. What was his first name? Henry Bates noticed that some species mimicked each other, and one of the species didn't actually have the venom or toxin. So here's a case. This is a species that lives here in Illinois. This is the bee mimicking fly, and I just think the bee mimicking flies are adorable. They look like tiny, tiny little bees, but you can tell that they're flies if you see them on a flower. These flowers are extremely tiny. Makes it look big, but it's really not that big. You can tell by the way they hold their wings are very fly-like and not like a bee. And also their eyes. Look at the giant eyes here. Much different from a bee. And it has no sting. It's not toxic or venomous in any way. So that makes it Batesian mimicry, when a harmless species mimics something that's harmful. And the fly benefits because a bird that wants to eat it is going to hesitate because it looks like warning coloration. So here's a weird case. There's quite a few caterpillars, or those are larvae of butterflies or moths. There's quite a few caterpillars whose posterior ends look like something harmful. And here's one that this is the posterior end of the caterpillar, and it can puff itself up to look like a snake head. So it scares off birds because, of course, the primary predator of caterpillars are birds. And many of them have defenses against birds. And this is one. They actually will, this caterpillar will raise its hind end up, puff it up so it looks like a snake head. And it works very effectively at scaring off birds because, of course, snakes are a predator of birds. Mullerian mimicry is when species imitate each other, but they're both either venomous or unpalatable. Unpalatable means bad tasting. So you probably know that bees and wasps all have very similar warning coloration with the yellow or orange and black stripes. And so they benefit. Why would species imitate each other? Well, they benefit by training the local predators. So a bird that has a bad encounter with one species of bee or wasp is going to be hesitant about any other species that looks similar. So that's Mullerian mimicry. They both have the same defense, and they imitate each other because it helps train the local predator population to stay away from them all. So mimicry by predators can be really interesting. We have mantises here that are camouflaged, they're green, but if you're a mantis that lives on colorful flowers like orchids in the tropics, many of those species are colorful so that they blend in with the flowers. Mantises are insects that are ambush predators. They can't run. They do fly, but that's not how they catch their prey. They hold very still for hours and wait for an insect mostly, but they'll also eat other things. Small mammals, even small birds, mantises have been seen eating hummingbirds. So being camouflaged is important. So this is an orchid mantis, not on the normal pink flowers or purple flowers on which it would sit and wait for its prey. And I found out recently you can actually buy these orchid mantises as pets, and they send them to you in the mail. They're very pretty, very interesting. You can feed them crickets if you have them as pets. Here's another predator that's a really good at camouflage. Octopus, you probably know, are very good at camouflage. And this one, though, this particular species, the mimic octopus, doesn't just try to blend into the surroundings. Most octopus will try to look like a rock or blend in with the coral or blend in with the sand. The mimic octopus actually looks like other animals to fool its prey into not being afraid of it, or to frighten away animals that, like larger fish, that might want to eat the octopus. So it can look like a toxic sea snake. These are all the same species of octopus. It can look like a flounder. It can look like a stingray. If it's looking like a flounder, it's probably trying to fool other fish so that they're not afraid of it. So that would be an example of camouflage that's really kind of extreme. Herbivory is a type of predation practiced by animals on plants. So animals that eat plants are herbivores. And this is negative for the plants, with the exception of fruit. Some plants make fruit that is intended to be attractive to animals and get them to eat it. We'll talk more about that when we get to the plants unit. But generally, plants don't want to be eaten, and they make toxins and bitter tasting compounds and thorns and other things to try to keep themselves from being eaten. The herbivores have adaptations, and we will talk about these when we get to nutrition in animals, and we'll talk a bit about gut fermentation like ruminants have, and like hindgut fermenters like horses have. Plants have adaptations to prevent themselves from being eaten, and we'll talk when we get to the plant section more about this. They have mechanical defenses like spines, thorns, bark, and then they also have chemical defenses like poisonous compounds that they make. Parasitism is when one animal benefits and the other one is harmed. Generally, parasites live either on the body of their host or in the body of their host. If they live in the body of their host, they're endoparasites, like tapeworms would be endoparasites. Or they live on the external surface, and then they're ectoparasites, like this tick here would be an ectoparasite. This is a dog tick biting a person. It's not a deer tick, not one of the ones that carry Lyme disease. There's a lot of positive interactions as well. So mutualism is where both organisms benefit, and commensalism is where one benefits and the other one is neutral. So the zero means neutral, like squirrels living in trees. Squirrels are commensal organisms on trees. The tree is not generally harmed or benefited by the squirrels, but the squirrels benefit immensely from the tree. An example of a mutualistic relationship would be between coral and their symbiotic algae. So single-celled algae are taken in by the coral and live in the coral body between the cells. The coral benefits because the algae are photosynthetic and they make sugars, and the algae benefits because it's protected from being eaten by all the zillions of organisms in the water column that eat algae. So both benefit from this relationship. So it's a mutualistic relationship. Here's a particularly interesting example of a mutualistic relationship between acacia trees, and this is a species that lives in Mexico, and an ant species that has become symbiotic with them. So the acacia trees are apparently very tasty, because if you remove these ants experimentally, the acacia tree is quickly consumed by both insects and large animal herbivores in the area. So the tree greatly benefits by having a colony of ants living on it. And what the ants do is aggressively defend the tree. And in return, the tree feeds the ants. So the tree makes special little protein, like leaf extensions that the ants can eat. And these little yellow, they almost look like little extra leaves. They're full of extra protein and fatty acids for the ants to eat. They supply hollow horns. I think this is the species name, the common name is the bullhorn acacia. The ants live in the hollowed out giant thorns on this tree, so that the tree gives them food and a place to live, and in return the ants aggressively defend the tree against other insects. They will attack and bite and kill any insect. They will attack any animal that tries to browse on the leaves. So if a small animal comes over and starts nibbling on the leaves, the ants will run onto that animal's head and aggressively bite it. They also kill plants growing nearby, so that no trees or other plants are going to compete with this acacia tree for water or for sunlight. And in this picture here, you can see this large cleared area around the acacia tree. The ants did that, and they're quite aggressive. I have seen videos of people experimentally taking a vine and just laying it on the tree, and the ants chop it up into pieces, destroy it very, very quickly. So this is an example, a kind of an extreme example of a mutualistic relationship here between an ant species and a plant species. Anemones and clownfish also have a mutualistic relationship. We've all probably seen the movie Finding Nemo, where there's a clownfish that lives in an anemone. So anemones are animals. They have a single opening digestive tract. They eat small fish and other small animals that are in the water column. Some of them have, like corals, have photosynthetic algae living in them. But what do the clownfish do? So they have stinging tentacles like corals do. What the clownfish do, the clownfish clean up the mess. So whatever little bits of food and chopped up little pieces of fish the anemone doesn't quite get into its mouth, the clownfish will eat that. The clownfish will aggressively defend its anemone against other fish who might come over and try to nibble on it and bite pieces off of the tentacles. The clownfish will defend its anemone against attack in that case. And so they both benefit. The clownfish gets food because it gets to eat the anemone's scraps, and it also is in a very safe place. The larger predatory fish aren't going to come anywhere near that anemone because of the stinging tentacles. So both benefit. I don't know if this video shows very much. Oh, that's just our... And the clownfish are immune to the stings of the anemone. So here's another type of anemone fish here. We have a commensal organism as well. We have a species of arachnid that lives on us. Most mammals do. The genus name is Demodex. And this is a scanning electron micrograph of what they look like. You can see the little legs here, and if you count them, there's 4 pairs of legs, so that's how we know they're arachnids. They have 8 legs like spiders. They're extremely tiny. The length of one worm is only about half of a millimeter. You'll never see them. They live by the thousands on everyone's face, mostly in your eyelashes, in the eyelash follicles, and in your hair follicles on your forehead. They're commensals, though, because they eat our oil secretions, they eat our dead skin cells. They cause no harm, and we are not harmed or helped. You can remove them and it doesn't do anything. But they benefit, so that's why they're commensals. There are species of Demodex that are harmful. They're mange, which you probably heard about if you have a dog or a cat. Mange is a type of Demodex infection. It's a different species that causes the hair, it infects the hair follicles so much and causes so much inflammation that the hairs fall out, and so you get bald patches. There's a human version of mange that's called scabies that's caused by a different species of Demodex. So this particular species is a commensal, but there are other species of Demodex that are parasitic because they harm the host. Sometimes a relationship can be both mutualistic and commensal. So for example, this African water buffalo, there's normally these cattle egrets that hang around the water buffalo. They benefit in a number of ways from the water buffalo. As the water buffalo walks around and eats grass, they stir up insects that the cattle egrets eat. But the cattle egrets can also eat ticks and other skin parasites. So in that case, then they would be mutualistic. But if they're just hanging around eating insects in the grass that the buffalo are stirring up, then that would be commensalism. We can also see this with plants. So here's an example. This is a type of marsh plant that benefits the other plants when it's present. So that would be a mutualistic relationship. So this is a marsh plant called a black rush that's on the east coast of the United States. And where it is present, you find greater species diversity. And that's one of the ways that we tell that an ecosystem is healthy, is if you have species diversity. So generally, anything you do to an ecosystem that causes the number of species to go down, generally that's a sign of some kind of harm or disturbance to that particular ecosystem. So the presence of this species, of this black rush, which it looks kind of like grass, but it's not actually grass. Rushes are similar to grass. So the genus name is Juncus. This is what it looks like when it's in a big field. And if you remove it, or if you find places where it's just naturally not present, you find a lower diversity of plant species. And so the scientists studying this wondered why does, when this species is present, do you get a greater diversity of other plant species? And the reason has to do with where it's found. It's found in salt marshes. So salt marshes are found near the ocean. So you have an encroachment of salty ocean water into a salt marsh. And Juncus helps the soil stay moist so that the actual concentration of salt is less. Because if there's more water, then the salt concentration is less. So, and there are many species that can tolerate some salt, but when the salt rises too high, those species can no longer survive. So without this species, salt levels tend to be higher, and so fewer species can tolerate that high salt level. So that's one of the ways that the presence of this species benefits other species. Okay, when we come back in the next video, we'll talk about food webs.